So Peter Hitchens and Alison Morris here to go with some of those front page stories. And Peter, a lot of big stories around tomorrow, not just calls for tighter restrictions, which we'll come on to in a moment, but also, of course, the paper's marking the rollout of a second vaccine, the AstraZeneca, the Oxford vaccine, from tomorrow. And you've picked out the Telegraph's take on this. It's on their front page, but not their main story. Their headline there is NHS refuses to commit to 2 million jabs a week as the Oxford rollout begins.
Well, it's probably pretty wise of them. It's a huge government project, and wouldn't it be a terrible surprise if it didn't turn out to work as promised? This is an enormous and extremely complicated and hard to organise thing. And I think there may have been a certain amount of over-optimism about how quickly it could be done. What a pity that is, because I think the vaccination, whatever one may think of it, is almost certainly the only way that the country will recover its sanity. All these stories saying, here we go again, another lockdown. Why don't they provoke in any minds the question, if these lockdowns are so effective, why haven't they achieved their aim by now? We keep doing this thing, definition of madness, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. Each time we do it, we come back a few weeks later and say, oh, look, let's do it again. And Keir Starmer, of course, is, rather than being the leader of the opposition, is the leader of the even more militant government, saying, let's do it even before the government says we should do it. There's a wonderful cartoon a few weeks ago in the Daily Telegraph by Bob Moran showing Keir Starmer in this sort of wooden-faced Superman look, pulling at a huge lever and saying, workers of the world, good night, because every one of these lockdowns destroys the jobs of thousands of his members and voters. So it's a curious position. Why? It is extraordinary, the hypnotic force of all this going on. Okay. The more we do it, the more people don't criticise it. I just can't understand why everyone puts up with it.
Well, we'll come back to the issue of lockdowns and whether or not the situation would actually be a lot worse if there hadn't been restrictions. But let's just stick with the vaccine rollout for the moment while we're looking at this story. Alison, what do you make of this? Obviously, great hope being put on a second vaccine joining the Pfizer-BioNTech one that's already begun to be rolled out across the country. Clearly a huge logistical challenge ahead.
And the problem is that we know that the test, track and trace, which again was a huge challenge, hasn't been as successful as it was supposed to be, despite billions of pounds being thrown at that. So it's really important to get this right. As you said, the Pfizer vaccine, which is quite difficult to distribute given the temperatures it has to be kept at, that's already been getting rolled out here in Northern Ireland. Up to 80% of people in care homes and care home staff have already received their first jab. This one should make things easier. It's easier stored, it's easier distributed and sent out to places, but it is going to require every single available person who can administer it. And I think that the government really need to be making sure that everyone who works in, all kinds of aspects of the health service, be they physiotherapists, be they, ordinary care workers, elder care, they all need to be brought in and all trained in how to administer this vaccine to get as many people on the ground getting it out as possible, because we really keep being told that spring will be better, but unless the vaccine is rolled out to as many elderly and vulnerable people and frontline workers as possible, well, then the spring is just going to be more of the same. And we were already here in lockdown, I think, point 3 we're in now in Northern Ireland. Everything is closed here, bar essential retail. Schools will not be starting back till tomorrow. The minute anything is opened up, we've seen a huge spike in cases, and that will continue to be the case until we get to a point where people are vaccinated and safe. So that getting the vaccination right is huge. It's probably the biggest undertaking that the government will have to do in relation to trying to get a grip on this vaccine. And if we are to have a better spring, if we are to try and put some normality back in our lives, this is the most crucial aspect of it.
Well, yes, and one of the decisions that's been made, Peter, to try to reach more people more quickly is to increase the gap between the first and second doses. Even though you may not get as much protection from the first dose as opposed to 2 doses, it will at least carry some protection to a greater number of people. Do you have some sympathy with that decision? Does it make sense to you?
That makes perfect sense. I think you do get a pretty good amount of protection once it's taken. I think it's not immediate from the first jab, and I think it would be very sensible to do that to extend the cover. I say anything which helps us to get our sanity back has to be good. And obviously, those people who are vulnerable to the disease, most vulnerable to the disease, which, as everybody who studies it knows, largely affects those even older than me and even less fit than me. Those people can be protected, and once that can be established to have been done, then the rest of us can go back to normal. One hopes. This is, after all, the first occasion in human history when anybody is quarantined the healthy rather than the sick. And it would be nice for that to come to a definitive end. But as I say, it's all psychological. It seems to me the moment people start examining this, they will see that the vaccination it may comfort some people, but it's not really that crucial. The thing has been hugely exaggerated. We have these tales night after night. No, it's huge announcements of cases, so-called. And these are not cases. It's completely misleading to call them cases. They are positive tests. The tests are not
huge number of positive tests.
They cannot be tests. Even to say this gets me interrupted. But it's evident to anybody who looks at it that all this represents is the vigor and energy of the government in sending out people to make tests. The government's own posters, its own propaganda posters, admit that 1/3 of these so-called cases don't have any symptoms. If the government admits that, I would imagine the figure is considerably higher. We're being constantly told that things are worse than in reality they are. And
okay, well, hang on. Let me just come back at some of that with you. Apologies for interrupting.
Have yet another close down of the economy when the schools are likely to be closed down disastrously.
Okay.
For the children, particularly of the poor.
Okay, let me just come back at some of those points, because we haven't got a huge amount of time, and I just want to pick you up on some of those things. You talk about the number of cases. Some are asymptomatic, and the risk is, of course, that some of those people might pass on the virus to other people. But there has been over 75,000 deaths from this virus, haven't there? There are 20,000 people in hospital. I mean, this is a very serious problem.
Well, it's not unserious, but it's not as serious as it's proclaimed to be. There have been deaths of people who have had positive tests for COVID, but as Dr. Jenny Harris, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, said in April, deaths with are not necessarily deaths from. And as Dr. John Lee, the distinguished pathologist, has said, the actual way in which we've counted deaths, highly suspect, and may well have exaggerated. And here's another thing. We have the very large numbers of people are indeed in hospital, and the National Health Service is indeed very stretched. But if you look at the headlines of newspapers of 3 years ago, you'll find exactly the same thing. It's tragically almost normal, because of the great shortage of beds created by Tory and Labour governments over the past 20 years. It's tragically almost normal for the National Health Service to have a winter crisis.
Okay, I'm going to let Alison come in at this point.
We need to get a bit more careful.
Okay, well, Alison, you have a word while we look at the Metro. Happy New Year. This is the calls for tougher lockdowns to try to combat the rising cases.
And the reason why they have to combat the rising cases is because there is no capacity in the NHS. Here in Northern Ireland, it's at almost full capacity. People seem to think that means that every single hospital corridor is full, and it doesn't. It means there was Nightingale hospitals, which millions of pounds were invested into, which are completely unusable because there are no staff to man them. And the issue is that a bed without a nurse and a doctor who are able to tend to that patient is just a bed. That's all it is. And that's where we've had the real problem. During the summer, when we had a lull in cases, here in Northern Ireland, there were almost single figures. That was the time at which the capacity of the NHS should have been increased to cope. Unfortunately, it wasn't. But look, we are where we are. And at the minute, the virus is uncontrollable. It's an uncontrollable rate. That's the same all across Europe. It's not just unique to us. Other countries have tried different types of lockdown. They've all ended up basically back in the more or less the same situation, apart from those countries that locked down and closed their borders and went for zero COVID. Germany, again, is having to look at stricter measures, even though they were being held up as an example at the very beginning in March and April. There's nothing much. We can't go back. We don't have a time machine. We can't go back. Not that I would ever want to go back anywhere near 2020 again. I think I'm pretty much done with that. But we do need to look forward as to what we're going to do. And the fact is that in these winter months, when there is no hospital capacity, it's unfortunate, and I hate because I know that it's unfair to the poorest in our population. We don't all have the same kind of lockdown. Some of us have lovely, comfortable lockdowns, and some of us don't. But the fact is that the only way to stop this now is to get the vaccine rolled out, and it should be being administered 24 hours a day, in my opinion. I'm quite sure that many people will quite happily go to a clinic or a leisure centre, wherever they're going to be rolled out, and have their jab at 2 o'clock in the morning if they thought that would speed this process up. And that's what really needs to be done, I think.
OK, and let's talk about the issue of schools as well, Peter, because the front page of the Daily Star, they're taking issue with Boris Johnson, who talked today about schools being safe. And clearly there are some councils that don't want to open schools, even if they are allowed to. Some individual schools also taking that decisions themselves. There are teachers who are concerned. There are some parents who are concerned as well. Where do you stand on this?
Well, it's completely understandable that both parents and teachers are concerned, given the way in which the government has spent the past 9 months, really, fanning the flames of fear. Something which it made clear it would do in the original Sage minutes of March, where they decided we weren't scared enough. If you make people scared, it's very, very hard to stop them being scared. I agree with Alison. I'm not sure about 2 in the morning. Certainly, it would make sense to have the vaccinations as available as possible for as long as possible each day and night if it's going to bring this fear to an end. The government actually knows perfectly well that closing the schools is a disaster, and which will have enormous lengthy consequences both for the social cohesion and the economy of this country and for the education of very large numbers of people, and hits the poor particularly hard. And they tried hugely hard last summer to get the schools back open again, and now they're losing that battle. But it is fundamentally their fault for spreading so much fear, which has been the whole way in which they behaved. And although I think myself that the schools should remain open, I can quite understand why people are reluctant to send their children to them in some cases.
Alison?
It's so difficult. Our schools won't be opening here tomorrow morning. The schools are going to stay closed at this stage until January the 11th. And then they're looking at maybe trying to bring the younger children and kids who have exams in, but let some of the other children remote learn. I'm really torn by this. I mean, I have friends and relatives. My sister teaches special needs. There's really difficult aspects to this, and some children are at home trying to do their online learning on a phone with a broken screen, while others have access to laptops. Some children don't even have a kitchen table. They live in a small flat. They've nowhere to sit and do their work. All of this, I think, it creates such an unequal society. We already had an unequal society, but by virtue of postcode, it's even more unequal now, depending on where you were born and what your parents do and how much money they have. And we're going to be mopping up the mess that this is going to create for decades to come. But I do think at this stage there's maybe scope for having a week's extra holiday to those children to let schools get more safety precautions in place. The transport's a really big issue. And we do think that while younger children probably are of no risk of even spreading it, I think that once you get into post-primary and start looking at teenage children, there's maybe some way that it could be done, some more remote learning or hybrid learning until the vaccine is rolled out.
OK, we must take a break right there. Plenty to talk about in just a moment, including You'll Never Walk Alone, says Gerry, says The Mirror, as tributes are paid to the 78-year-old who's died of a short illness. More on that after the break. Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview with me tonight, Peter Hitchens and Alison Morris. And Alison, we're going to kick off with tributes being paid. You've picked out the Mirror's coverage, but no doubt all the papers will be picking up on Gerry Marsden of Gerry and the Pacemakers, who has died aged 78. And there'll be a lot of people being very sad at his passing, particularly in Liverpool.
I do, and I think that, earlier when you were showing the sort of clip of him, and when you hear the song, I mean, it gives you goosebumps no matter when you hear You'll Never Walk Alone. I think that after the Hillsborough disaster, that song came to mean so much to the people of that city. Liverpool's a place I love to visit. I mean, most of the people in Liverpool are Irish anyway, let's face it, or of Irish descent. There's probably more Irish people there than there are in Belfast. So I think that, we know that the whole city will be in mourning. And had this been normal times and not pandemic times, can you imagine the send-off he would have received? Hopefully, when all this is over, he'll have some sort of fitting tribute to him in that city, because I know that, given he's one of their favourite sons, a legend, they'd like to say goodbye to him in a fitting manner.
I think that's right. I think a lot of people will absolutely agree with that. We are very short of time, Peter. I wonder if I can move us on, unless you wanted to particularly have a word about Gerry Marsden.
It's sad for people of my generation, particularly this. We knew that people like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin were not going to be with us for long because the lives they lived. But Gerry and the pacemakers, as I remember them, they weren't like that. And when they start to disappear, then you know that it's over for you before too long. So it's quite poignant. And I actually took that last time I was in Liverpool. I actually took that ferry, which is no longer a regular service, just for the sake of it, because the song "Ferry Across the Mersey" will not come out of my head. So it's important. These moments are poignant and should be marked. I'm all in favour of marking them.
Indeed, indeed. Alison, very briefly, if you can, talk us through. There's a little story on the front of the Daily Telegraph. We didn't quite get time to get to it last hour, but it has an intriguing headline, "The Search for the Secret Scallywag Bunkers." If you can explain very briefly, we'd be grateful.
Apparently, this was a sort of a militia, a sort of sabotage unit that were placed into these bunkers, which exist all over England during World War II, in case the Nazis invaded and these people were to come out and start setting fire to the infrastructure and all sorts of other things. But they still exist now. I'm intrigued, as to where they are. I imagine they could be put to great use. Currently, right now, the way things are, I wouldn't mind a Scallywag bunker of my own that I could retreat to every now and then, just for some peace and quiet.
OK, on that note, I'm so sorry, Peter, we are out of time, but Peter and Alison, thanks both very much indeed.